Engine heat baked through stiff denim, radiating against shins bruised from kickstarts and bad choices. Dust coated everything inside the roadside diner. It tasted like rust and burnt coffee. Crow wanted nothing more than a lukewarm beer and silence. Instead, a frail shadow fell over his battered booth, a throat cleared, dry as dead leaves. "Mind if I join you?" the old man whispered. Crow stared at the faded Hell's Angels patch on his own chest. Seconds later, silence. Nobody moved. The diner didn't fall into a cinematic hush where the jukebox suddenly died and the patrons gasped. It was uglier than that. It was the awkward, suffocating quiet of a dozen people simultaneously deciding to mind their own business to survive. A trucker in the corner booth carefully lowered his greasy fork, his eyes fixed firmly on his plate of runny eggs. The grill cook, a heavy man with a sweat-stained bandana, stopped scraping the flat top, the metal spatula hovering an inch above the sizzling onions. Crow kept his hands flat on the cracked vinyl of the table. His knuckles were black with road grime and grease. The skin split over the joints from a minor disagreement outside a bar in Barstow 3 days ago. He didn't look up at the old man right away. He looked at the man's hands. They were resting on the edge of the table. Thin, translucent skin dotted with liver spots, veins mapping a geography of old age and failing circulation. The nails were yellowed, thick, but neatly clipped, a stark contrast to the filth underneath Crow's own fingernails. Across the booth, Wyatt, everyone called him Brick, stopped chewing. Brick was a massive, square-headed man whose leather cut looked like it was crying out in distress over his barrel chest. He smelled intensely of sour sweat, stale chewing tobacco, and the harsh chemical tang of exhaust fumes. Brick swallowed, a loud, wet sound in the sudden quiet of the diner. "You lost, Pop?" Brick growled. His voice sounded like gravel being crushed in a cement mixer. He didn't sound threatening, exactly, but there was a heavy, blunt edge to it, the kind of edge that preceded a hand wrapping around a throat. Crow finally lifted his chin. His neck cracked. He was 38, but his spine felt 60. 6 hours on a vibrating Harley-Davidson without a windshield had rattled his brain against his skull until he felt nauseous. His eyes, rimmed with red, met the old man's. The old man wasn't trembling. That was the first thing Crow noticed, and it sent a weird microscopic itch crawling up his spine. Normal civilians trembled. They avoided eye contact. They stuttered when they saw the death's head patch, the bottom rocker that declared territory, the sheer, unapologetic menace of a Hell's Angel in the wild. This guy was just standing there. He wore a faded corduroy jacket that smelled faintly of camphor and peppermint, a smell that transported Crow violently back to his grandfather's suffocating living room in Oregon. The old man's eyes were watery, encased in folds of wrinkled skin, but the irises were a startling pale blue. They were locked dead onto Crow. "I am exactly where I intend to be," the old man said. His voice was a rasp, barely pushing past his vocal cords. Crow's jaw worked. He tasted the grit of the highway between his molars. He didn't feel heroic. He didn't feel a sudden urge to be kind to a senior citizen. He felt profoundly irritated. His boots, heavy harness leather, shifted under the table. His right knee bumped the steel pedestal of the table, a dull throb radiating up his thigh. "Booth's full," Crow said flatly. It wasn't. There was plenty of room next to him on the curved banquette, but the unwritten rules of the road dictated that you didn't invade the space of a patched member unless you had a death wish, a badge, or a profound lack of sanity. The old man didn't blink. He just exhaled, a slow, rattling sound, and slid into the booth next to Crow. Silence descended again, heavier this time. It settled over the table like a suffocating blanket. Brick's thick fingers curled inward. His right hand casually drifted down toward his hip, where the heavy brass buckle of his belt sat next to a folded buck knife in a leather sheath. Crow didn't stop him. He just watched the old man. The audacity of it was so raw, so completely devoid of instinctual self-preservation, that it looped right past insulting and landed squarely in the territory of bizarre. "Coffee," the old man said, not to them, but to the terrified waitress hovering near the cash register. "Black, if it's not too much trouble." The waitress, a woman in her late 40s with tired eyes and a name tag that read Patty, practically vibrated as she grabbed a brown-rimmed pot and practically sprinted over. She didn't look at Crow. She didn't look at Brick. She poured the coffee with shaking hands, spilling a few dark drops onto the formica. "Sorry," she squeaked, backing away quickly. The smell of the burnt coffee mixed with the camphor radiating from the old man. Crow felt a headache blooming right behind his eyes, sharp and hot. He needed a beer. He needed a bed. He did not need a suicidal geriatric case studying him like a bug under glass. "You got about 3 seconds," Brick said, leaning forward. The vinyl creaked violently under his weight. "To explain why you got a death wish, old-timer." 3 seconds, the old man repeated, his voice barely a whisper. He wrapped his thin, gnarled fingers around the steaming porcelain mug. He didn't flinch at the heat. A very brief window for a complicated explanation. Crow shifted his weight, putting an inch more space between his leather jacket and the old man's corduroy sleeve. The physical proximity was maddening. He could hear the faint, wet click of the man's dentures when he spoke. He could see the yellowed, flaky skin at his hairline. It was repulsive and intimate, stripping away the impenetrable aura the club patches were supposed to project. "Make it simple, then," Crow muttered, resting his elbows on the table. His shoulders slumped. He was too tired for violence. Violence required energy. It required adrenaline. Right now his tank was completely dry. "Before my brother here decides to show you the parking lot." "Zhriyam," Brick grunted in agreement, his eyes narrowing to angry slits. He was a creature of simple mechanics. Problem presents itself. Problem gets hit until it goes away. The old man took a slow, agonizingly deliberate sip of his coffee. His throat bobbed. He set the mug down with a soft click against the saucer. "You're Miller," the old man said. He didn't look at Brick. His watery blue eyes stayed on Crow. "They call you Crow, president of the Lower Valley Charter." The air in the booth seemed to turn to solid glass. Brick stopped breathing. His hand stopped hovering over his knife. It gripped the handle. Crow felt a cold prickle of sweat break out at the base of his neck, right where the heavy silver chain he wore bit into his skin. His cynical apathy vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp clarity. Civilians didn't know his last name. They barely knew his road name. They certainly didn't know the internal hierarchy of charters separated by 200 miles of desert. "You've got me at a disadvantage," Crow said. His voice was lower now, stripped of the irritated drawl. It was the voice he used during sit-downs with rival clubs. Flat, empty, dangerous. "My name is Azrael," the old man said. He reached into the breast pocket of his corduroy jacket. Brick was half out of his seat in an instant, his knee slamming upward into the underside of the table. The coffee cups rattled violently. The brown liquid sloshed over the rims, pooling on the scratched formica. "Hands where I can see 'em, you crazy old bastard," Brick hissed, pulling the buckknife halfway from its sheath. The snap of the leather strap was loud in the quiet diner. Crow didn't flinch. He just watched Azrael's shoulder. The movement was slow, painful. There was no sudden jerk, no concealed weapon dynamic. Just the rusty mechanics of an old body doing what it was told. "Easy, Brick," Crow murmured, raising 2 fingers off the table in a minimal gesture of restraint. "He's pulling a gun at that speed. We got time to finish our drinks before he cocks it." Brick didn't sit down entirely. He hovered, a coiled mass of muscle and aggression, his eyes locked on the old man's trembling hand. Azrael's hand emerged from the pocket. It wasn't a gun. It was a small, heavy object wrapped in a piece of oil-stained flannel. He placed it carefully on the table, right in the center, between the spilled coffee and a crumpled sugar packet. "I am not here to insult you," Asriel said, his breathing a little heavier now from the exertion of the tense moment. The smell of camphor seemed to intensify, mixing unpleasantly with the acidic scent of the spilled coffee. "I am here because my time is running out, and the universe has a cruel sense of humor, placing you on this specific stretch of highway on this specific day. Crow stared at the flannel bundle. The fabric was old, the kind of worn soft cotton that only comes from years of use in a garage. It was tied with a piece of dirty twine. "What's in the rag, Asriel?" Crow asked. He didn't reach for it. He knew better than to touch things blind. "A memory," Asriel whispered, "and a debt." Crow laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound that held absolutely no humor. It startled the trucker in the corner, who immediately dropped his eyes back to his eggs. "We don't do memory lane," Crow said, rubbing a hand over his face. The stubble on his jaw felt like sandpaper against his palm. "And if you owe the club money, you go through the sergeant-at-arms, not me. You definitely don't ambush me in a diner halfway to Reno." "I don't owe the club," Asriel said quietly. His pale blue eyes seemed to darken, catching the dim fluorescent light hanging above the booth. "I owe you." Crow frowned. He searched his memory. He had an encyclopedic brain for faces, debts, grudges, and slights. It was how he stayed alive. It was how he kept his charter from imploding. He looked at the liver spots, the sagging jowls, the fragile architecture of the man's skull visible beneath thinning white hair. Nothing. "I've never seen you before in my life," Crow said. "No," Asriel agreed. "You haven't. But you knew my son." The diner, which had felt suffocatingly quiet before, suddenly felt like a vacuum. The ambient noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of a passing semi-truck on the interstate, faded into a dull, rushing sound in Crow's ears. Brick slowly lowered his heavy frame back onto the vinyl seat. He didn't put the knife away, but the immediate threat of violence evaporated, replaced by a dense, confused tension. He looked at Crow, waiting for a cue. Crow didn't give one. He stared at the flannel bundle. A bad feeling, heavy and cold like a swallowed stone, settled in his stomach. "A lot of guys have sons," Crow said slowly. "A lot of them run with us. A lot of them don't make it. You're going to have to be more specific, Asriel." Asriel reached out with one shaking finger and nudged the bundle toward Crow. The twine slipped loose. "Open it," the old man whispered. Crow didn't want to touch it. Every survival instinct honed over 2 decades of riding with the 1% screamed at him to slide out of the booth, tell Brick to start the bikes, and leave this weird, camphor-smelling ghost in the dust. You didn't invite ghosts to the table. They only brought misery. But the sheer exhaustion gnawing at his bones made him reckless. Or maybe it was the finality in the old man's eyes. It was the look of a man who had entirely given up on tomorrow. Crow reached out. His thick fingers, scarred from road rash and fistfights, clumsily caught the edge of the oily flannel. He pulled the fabric back. The clunk of heavy metal hitting the table sounded like a gunshot. It was a Zippo lighter. But it wasn't standard issue. It was oversized, custom machined from a solid block of dull, brushed steel. It was scratched, dented, and blackened around the chimney from years of use. But it was the engraving on the face of the lighter that made the breath catch in Crow's throat. It wasn't the standard club insignia. It was a variation. A skull missing its lower jaw. A jagged crack running down the frontal bone flanked by 2 crossed pistons. But beneath that, engraved with deep, angry strokes by someone using an awl and a heavy hammer, were 3 letters, DTM. Brick leaned over, squinting at the metal. "What is it? Looks like junk." Crow couldn't speak. His mouth had gone completely dry. The metallic taste of adrenaline flooded the back of his tongue, bitter and sharp. He felt a sudden, violent urge to throw up. He blinked, hard, trying to clear the image, but the lighter sat there, anchoring reality to the scratched table. DTM. Death to Mechanics. It was an inside joke, a stupid, drunken inside joke from a lifetime ago, a time before he was Crow, a time when he was just Jackson, a scrawny prospect scrubbing oil pans and taking beatings with a grin because he thought the patch meant brotherhood. There was only one person who carried a lighter with that specific, botched engraving, a guy who could strip a panhead engine blindfolded but couldn't spell his way out of a paper bag. "Where did you get this?" Crow's voice didn't sound like his own. It was thin, reedy. He cleared his throat violently, trying to push the weakness down. Azrael watched him, his pale eyes cataloging every micro-expression on Crow's face. The shock, the recognition, the sudden, poorly concealed grief. "I think you know," Azrael said gently. "I asked you a question," Crow snarled, the apathy entirely burned away. He grabbed the lighter. The metal was surprisingly cold. It felt heavy in his palm, a dense weight of history he thought he had successfully buried under miles of asphalt and bad decisions. "Where the hell did you get Tommy's lighter?" Brick flinched. He had ridden with Crow for 6 years, but he only knew the legends. Everyone knew the legend of Tommy Spades Kennedy, the golden boy of the original charter, the guy who went down in a blaze of stupid glory against a rival club in 2004, taking 3 of them with him before the cops arrived. He was a martyr, a cautionary tale, a ghost. "He was my boy," Azrael whispered. The rasp in his voice caught, turning into a wet, rattling cough. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it to his mouth. When he pulled it away, there were no cinematic specks of blood, just yellowed spit. "Thomas, you called him Spades." Crow stared at the old man. He looked for the resemblance. He looked for the cocky, wide-jawed grin that Tommy always wore, even when he was bleeding. He looked for the reckless fire in the eyes. He saw nothing, just a dying man in a corduroy coat. "Tommy's been dead for 20 years, Crow said, his voice flat, trying to regain control. He squeezed the lighter until the sharp edges bit into his calluses. "He didn't have family. He told us he was a ward of the state. He said his old man drank himself to death when he was 12. Azrael let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it wasn't so broken. "Thomas was always a gifted storyteller. The truth was far too boring for him. I didn't drink myself to death. I was an accountant in Fresno. I drove a beige sedan. I asked him to cut his hair and go to community college." The absurdity of it hit Crow like a physical blow. Tommy Spades, the wildest brawler the club had ever seen, the guy who once rode his chopper through the plate glass window of a rival bar just to make a point, was the son of an accountant from Fresno. "Why are you here?" Crow asked, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table. The smell of camphor was suffocating him now. He wanted to leave. He wanted to kick his bike over and ride until his gas tank ran dry and the desert swallowed him whole. "Why wait 20 years to track me down?" Azrael folded the handkerchief precisely and placed it back in his pocket. His movements were slow, stalling for time. "Because I didn't care about you," Azrael said brutally. The words lacked malice. They were just a cold statement of fact. "I hated you. I hated what you represented. I hated the noise, the dirt, the violence. When Thomas died, I buried him under his given name. I moved out of state, and I tried to forget he ever existed." Brick let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Cold, Pop. Real cold." Azrael ignored him. His eyes remained locked on Crow. "But a man gets older. The noise of the world gets quieter, and the ghosts get louder. I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 months ago. The doctors tell me I have weeks, perhaps days, some." Crow looked at the liver spots, the yellowed skin, the way the man's breath rattled in his chest. It wasn't a lie. The smell of camphor was just masking the smell of decay. "I don't give absolutions," Crow said softly, sliding the lighter back across the table. It stopped inches from Azriel's trembling fingers. I'm a mechanic, a brawler, and a criminal. I'm not a priest. If you want forgiveness for abandoning your kid, you're in the wrong diner. I don't want your forgiveness, Azriel whispered, his voice gaining a sudden, desperate strength. He didn't touch the lighter. He leaned forward, his face inches from Crow's, invading the space, invading the patch, invading the carefully constructed walls Crow had spent 2 decades building. I want the truth, Azriel said. His pale eyes burned with a feverish intensity. Thomas's mother died thinking her son was a hero who died defending his friends. The police report said it was a shootout. The papers called it gang warfare. Azriel reached out and laid his frail, trembling hand flat over the heavy steel lighter. But I cleaned out his apartment before your people could get to it, Azriel said, the rasp in his voice dropping an octave. I found his journal. I know he wanted out. I know he was going to turn over his patch the night he died. Crow stopped breathing. The diner noises faded to absolute zero. Tell me, Mr. Miller, Azriel whispered, the silence stretching out between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Did my son die fighting your enemies, or did he die because he wanted to stop fighting? Air conditioning hummed, a broken, rattling sound that suddenly seemed deafening in the cramped space. Crow felt the cracked vinyl of the booth digging into his thighs, the heat of his own body trapped beneath thick leather and denim. He stared at the scratched surface of the Zippo. The truth was an ugly, misshapen thing. He had spent 2 decades burying it beneath cheap beer, loud exhaust pipes, and the rigid, unquestionable dogma of the club. Beside him, Brick shifted, the heavy leather of his cut groaning. The younger biker's broad face contorted into a mask of deep, genuine confusion. What the hell is he talking about, Crow? Brick's voice was louder now, stripping away the careful, muted tension of the diner. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the old man. Spades died a hero. He took down 3 of the Vipers. Everyone knows the story. He went out in a blaze. They got a plaque for him up at the clubhouse. Crow didn't look at Brick. He couldn't. Brick was 10 years old when Tommy died. He had grown up on the myth. The entire Lower Valley Charter fed on that myth. It was the foundational lore that kept the young guys eager, reckless, and fiercely loyal. And Crow was the one who had helped write it. Memory flashed, unbidden and sharp. It didn't smell like corduroy and burnt coffee. It smelled like wet asphalt, cheap tequila, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone right before a thunderstorm. Tommy wasn't roaring a battle cry. He was crying. Actual ugly tears streaking through the dirt on his face behind a miserable, rain-soaked warehouse in Stockton. Crow felt a sickening drop in his gut. His hands, resting on his thighs beneath the table, began to tremble. A fine, uncontrollable vibration. He pressed his palms hard against his kneecaps to stop it. Azriel watched him. The old man didn't blink. He didn't press the issue or raise his voice. He just sat there, breathing through the pain of his failing pancreas, letting the terrible, suffocating silence do the heavy lifting. He was reading the guilt rolling off Crow in waves. "You're out of your mind, old man," Brick scoffed, his initial aggression returning, eager to defend the sacred history of the patch. Spades was a 1%er to the bone. He'd never turn his back. He wasn't a coward. "Brick," Crow said. His voice was entirely devoid of inflection. It sounded hollowed out. "I'm just saying, Crow, this guy is disrespecting—" "Shut up, Brick." It wasn't a yell. It was a command issued at a frequency that demanded immediate compliance. Brick snapped his mouth shut, his jaw muscles bulging. He glared at Azriel, but he leaned back against the vinyl, yielding to the president's authority. Crow slowly lifted his hands from beneath the table. He placed them flat on the formica, framing the flannel rag and the lighter. His knuckles were bone white. The headache behind his eyes had sharpened into a blinding spike. He hated Azriel in that moment. He hated him with a sudden, pure intensity for dragging a corpse into the daylight when everyone was perfectly happy with the headstone. You found a journal, Crow muttered, staring at his own grime-stained fingernails. A lot of guys write things down when they're drunk, when they're feeling the pressure. It doesn't mean they're going to act on it. Azrael shook his head, a slow, sad side-to-side motion. The fluorescent light caught the thin, papery skin of his scalp. Thomas wasn't a writer. He could barely string 2 sentences together on a birthday card. If he took the time to write down that he was terrified, that he couldn't sleep, that he was planning to pack a bag and ride to Oregon, he meant it. The old man coughed again, a deep, wet hack that shook his frail frame. He pressed the handkerchief to his lips, closing his eyes until the spasm passed. When he opened them, they were glassy with unshed tears. "He wrote about you, Jackson," Azrael whispered, using Crow's real name. The sound of it in the diner felt like a physical violation. "He said you were the only one who understood. He said he was going to tell you first. Did he tell you?" Crow felt the diner walls closing in. The trucker in the corner had finally abandoned his eggs, quietly sliding a $20 bill onto the table and slipping out the front door. Patty, the waitress, was nowhere to be seen, having retreated to the safety of the kitchen. "Go check the bikes, Brick," Crow said softly. Brick blinked, completely thrown off balance. "What? Crow, we ain't leaving this—" "I said go check the bikes." Crow turned his head, locking eyes with the younger man. The look in Crow's eyes was completely dead. There was no brotherhood in it, no camaraderie. It was a terrifying, empty void. "Check the oil. Tighten the primary chains. Stand by the door. Do not come back inside until I walk out." Brick swallowed hard. His immense shoulders deflated slightly. He recognized the tone. It was the tone that preceded things that ended up in shallow desert graves. He nodded slowly, sliding out of the booth. He shot one last venomous glare at Azrael before pushing his way out the heavy glass door of the diner. The bell above the door jingled a cheerful, mocking tune. Then, quiet. Crow was alone with the ghost's father. Dust motes drifted lazily in a shaft of harsh afternoon sunlight cutting across the table. Crow finally looked away from the Zippo. He looked at Azrael. He studied the deep grooves around the old man's mouth, the way his shoulders slumped beneath the oversized corduroy jacket. "He told me," Crow said. The words tasted like ash. Azrael exhaled. It was a long, shuddering sigh, as if a terrible weight had just shifted off his chest, only to be replaced by another. He closed his eyes. "When?" "The night he died," Crow answered. His voice was a flat monotone. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. If he felt it, he would break. And if he broke, he couldn't lead the charter. "We were behind a warehouse in Stockton. It was raining. He was strung out, exhausted. He said he was done. He had a bag packed on his bike. He wanted me to ride north with him." Azrael opened his eyes, leaning forward slightly. The smell of camphor was entirely overwhelmed by the stale stench of Crow's own nervous sweat. "And what did you say?" "I told him he was an idiot," Crow said brutally. He didn't sugarcoat it. He owed the man the ugly truth. "I told him you don't just walk away from the patch. You don't hand in your cut and go get a job at a hardware store. I told him Cobb would kill him for even suggesting it." Cobb. The name hung in the air like a bad smell. Cobb had been the vice president back then, a mean, raw-boned meth addict with a penchant for extreme violence and zero impulse control. He was dead now, rotting in a state penitentiary graveyard, but his ghost was just as heavy as Tommy's. "Did Cobb kill him?" Azrael asked. His voice didn't waver. Crow looked down at the lighter. He traced the jagged crack in the engraved skull with a dirty thumbnail. "Tommy wasn't a coward," Crow murmured, almost to himself. "But he was stupid. He didn't listen to me. He went inside to find Cobb. He thought if he just explained it, if he laid out his cut on the pool table, they'd let him walk because he'd put in his time." Crow stopped. The memory was clawing at the back of his throat. He reached for his cold, burnt coffee and took a sip. It tasted like battery acid. He forced it down. They were drunk. Cobb was high, Crow continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Cobb took it as an insult to the club. He started shoving Tommy. Tommy shoved back. I came in through the back door just as it escalated. Azrael's hands were flat on the table now. The trembling had stopped. He was perfectly, terrifyingly still. It wasn't a shootout with the Vipers, Crow said, forcing himself to look the old man in the eyes. There were no Vipers anywhere near Stockton that night. Cobb pulled a piece, a cheap, heavy .38 revolver. He was just trying to scare him, whip him across the jaw, teach him a lesson about respect. Crow swallowed hard. His throat clicked. Tommy swatted at his arm. The gun went off. It was an accident, a stupid, messy, drunken accident. Crow paused, letting the reality of it settle over the table. Caught Tommy right under the chin. He was dead before he hit the linoleum. Azrael didn't cry. He didn't scream. His face simply seemed to hollow out further, the skin tightening over his cheekbones. He stared at Crow, processing the profound, senseless waste of his son's life. And the shootout? Azrael rasped. The Vipers? The hero story? Damage control, Crow admitted, the shame finally bleeding into his voice, turning it bitter. If the cops found out a VP shot a patched member over a disagreement, the heat would have shut down the entire charter. We had a war brewing with the Vipers anyway. Cobb panicked. I helped him. Crow leaned back, putting distance between himself and the table. He felt entirely exhausted. His bones ached. We loaded Tommy's body into the back of a van. We drove to Viper territory. We dumped him in an alley where they hung out, fired a bunch of rounds into the brick walls to make it look like a crossfire, and left his gun in his hand. Crow rubbed his jaw. The cops bought it. The club bought it. Cobb made sure Tommy was celebrated as a martyr. It unified the charter. It gave us an excuse to wipe out the Vipers the next month. Silence descended on the diner again. It was absolute. You built an empire on his blood, Azrael stated. Not a question, a condemnation. We survived, Crow countered, his voice hardening defensively. If the truth came out, we all would have gone down. Tommy was already dead. Making him a hero meant his death served a purpose. It meant something to the guys left behind. It meant nothing, Azrael said, his voice cracking with sudden fierce grief. It was a lie to protect a murderer. Crow didn't argue. He couldn't. He stared at the custom Zippo. DTM death to mechanics. Tommy had just wanted to fix motorcycles and be left alone. I'm sorry, Crow said. It was the first time he had apologized to a civilian in 15 years. The words felt foreign and inadequate on his tongue. He didn't die defending us. He died because he wanted to be free of us. And we wouldn't let him. Azrael reached out slowly. His trembling fingers brushed against the cold steel of the lighter. He didn't pick it up. He just rested his fingertips against the engraved skull. He wanted to come home, Azrael whispered, a single tear finally escaping the corner of his eye, tracking through the deep wrinkles on his cheek. He packed a bag. He was coming home. Crow sat there, feeling the crushing weight of the leather patch on his back. It didn't feel like armor anymore. It felt like a shroud. I have days left, Mr. Miller, Azrael said, slowly pulling his hand back from the lighter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, dropping it next to his untouched coffee. I wanted to know the truth before I went. Now I do. The old man began the agonizingly slow process of sliding out of the booth. His joints popped. His breath wheezed. Crow didn't offer to help. He knew the gesture would be rejected. Azrael stood up, leaning heavily on the edge of the table. He looked down at Crow, the pale blue eyes entirely devoid of anger now. There was only pity. Keep the lighter, Azrael said, his voice a dry rasp. You have to carry it now, not me. The diner bell jingled above the door. a thin, tinny sound that lingered too long in the stagnant air. Crow didn't turn his head to watch Azrael leave. He just listened to the slow, shuffling scrape of the old man's orthopedics across the linoleum, followed by the heavy thud of the glass door closing. Then, it was just the hum of the broken AC unit again. Crow sat frozen. The scratch Zippo rested on the formica, catching the harsh overhead light. DTM. The letters mocked him. They weren't a battle cry. They were a plea for normalcy from a kid who had realized too late that he was entirely out of his depth. He reached out and closed his fist over the lighter. The metal had warmed slightly under the diner's lights, but it still felt alien and heavy. He shoved it deep into the front pocket of his jeans. It settled against his thigh, a hard, uncomfortable lump of steel that dug into his muscle with every slight movement. Crow slid out of the booth. His knees popped. The headache had spread from behind his eyes to the base of his skull, a tight, pulsing band of pressure. He pulled a crumpled 20 from his leather cut and tossed it onto the spilled coffee, not bothering to wait for the terrified waitress. Pushing through the diner doors, the desert heat hit him like an open oven. It smelled of baked asphalt, sagebrush, and the pungent chemical stink of diesel fuel from the nearby pumps. Brick was pacing near the bikes. He looked like a caged bear, his heavy boots crunching loudly in the gravel shoulder. The two Harley-Davidsons sat ticking in the afternoon sun, the metal contracting as the engines cooled. Brick stopped mid-stride when he saw Crow emerge, his thick brow furrowed, his jaw set. "Well?" Brick demanded, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that competed with the distant roar of the interstate. What the hell was that about? Guy looked like he was about to drop dead in his coffee. What did he want? Crow walked to his bike. He didn't look at Brick. He unhooked his heavy leather gloves from his belt and slowly, methodically pulled them on. The leather was stiff with dried sweat and road grime. It smelled like dead cow and oil. He worked his fingers into the stalls, feeling the familiar, comforting restriction of the material. "Nothing," Crow said. The word was dry, tasting of dust. Brick took a step closer, his massive frame blocking out the sun. "Don't feed me that, boss. I saw the look on your face." He pulled something out of that rag. What was it? And why the hell was he talking about spades? Crow paused. He looked up at Brick. Brick was loyal, brutally, unconditionally loyal to the patch, to the club, and to Crow. He would take a bullet for the man standing in front of him without a second thought. But that loyalty was conditional on the myth. It was built on the foundation of Tommy Spades dying like a warrior, not dying like a terrified kid trying to quit. If Crow told him the truth, the foundation would crack. The Lower Valley Charter was already a powder keg of young, aggressive recruits, itching for a war with anyone who looked at them sideways. If they found out the club's greatest martyr was a victim of friendly fire, covered up by the very leadership they swore to obey, they would tear the charter apart from the inside. Blood would spill. And for what? For an old man who was going to be dead in a week anyway? He was a scam artist, Crow said. The lie slipped out smoothly, coded in 2 decades of practice. He hated himself for how easy it was. Said he had Tommy's old ring, wanted to extort the club, wanted 10 grand or he'd go to the cops with some fake story about how Tommy owed his family money. Brick's face darkened. The confusion vanished, instantly replaced by pure righteous anger. This was a narrative he understood. Disrespect, extortion, a threat to the club. "I'll drag him behind the bike," Brick snarled, his hand dropping instinctively toward the heavy buck knife on his hip. He actually took a half step toward the parking lot, scanning for Azrael's vehicle. "I'll skin the old bastard. Nobody disrespects Spades." "Drop it," Crow barked. The sheer authority in his voice snapped like a whip. Brick froze, turning back to him, startled by the sudden venom. "Guy's dying of cancer," Crow said, swinging his right leg over the saddle of his Harley. The leather creaked beneath his weight. "He's pathetic. He's looking for a payout to cover his medical bills. We don't waste time on ghosts, and we don't beat up dying men in diner parking lots. It's bad for business. Brick hesitated, his jaw muscles working furiously as he chewed on his frustration. The violence was primed, but the target was denied. He spat a thick stream of brown tobacco juice onto the hot asphalt. It sizzled faintly. "Yeah, all right," Brick muttered, clearly unsatisfied but unwilling to challenge the president. He threw his leg over his own bike, a massive road glide that looked like a battered tank. "Still pisses me off." Crow didn't answer. He turned the ignition switch. He kicked the starter pedal, putting his entire body weight into the downward thrust. The V-twin engine exploded into life beneath him, a deafening, rhythmic roar that shook his teeth in his skull. The noise was usually a comfort. It drowned out thoughts. It drowned out doubts. But today, the vibration just felt like the engine was trying to shake the lighter loose from his pocket. The steel dug into his thigh, a persistent physical reminder of the rot festering beneath his leather cut. He clicked the bike into gear and dumped the clutch, peeling out of the gravel parking lot and onto the blinding white line of the highway. The ride back to the compound took 3 hours. For Crow, it was 3 hours of sensory deprivation masquerading as overload. The wind tore at his clothes, whipping the collar of his jacket against his neck until the skin was raw. The sun beat down, turning the black leather into a wearable furnace, but Crow felt completely cold. The numbness started in his chest and spread outward, chilling his blood. He stared blankly at the asphalt rushing beneath his front tire, a hypnotic blur of gray and yellow. He had ridden this stretch of road 1,000 times. He knew every pothole, every speed trap, every dead coyote rotting on the shoulder. It was his territory. But today, it felt alien. He felt like a trespasser in his own life. By the time they reached the outskirts of the lower valley, the sun had dipped below the jagged horizon of the mountains, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and sickly orange. The temperature plummeted. The sweat that had soaked Crow's t-shirt turned icy, clinging to his ribs. They turned off the 2-lane highway onto a deeply rutted dirt road. Dust plumed behind them, a thick, choking cloud that tasted of grit and dry alkali. A quarter-mile down the road, the compound emerged from the gloom. It was a sprawling, brutalist fortress of corrugated steel, cinder blocks, and chain-link fencing topped with rusted razor wire. As they pulled through the heavy iron gates, the sensory assault of the club washed over them. The smell of cheap beer, burning meat from a rusted oil drum smoker, and the sharp chemical tang of unwashed bodies and engine degreaser. Half a dozen bikes were parked haphazardly near the main entrance. A group of prospects, young, eager kids with clean denim and hungry eyes, scrambled to get out of the way as Crow and Brick roared into the yard. Crow killed the engine. The sudden silence in his ears was immediately filled by the heavy thumping bass of a stereo system pumping out old-school metal from inside the clubhouse. He sat on the bike for a long moment, staring at the scarred wooden doors of the main building. His legs felt like lead. He didn't want to go inside. For the first time in 20 years, the clubhouse didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a crime scene. "Long ride, boss," Brick grunted, hauling his massive frame off his bike. He stretched, his joints popping like firecrackers. He was already looking toward the bar, the anger at the old man forgotten, replaced by the primal need for a cold beer. "I'm parched." Crow nodded slowly. He dismounted, his boots crunching heavily in the gravel. He reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed the cold steel of the Zippo. He kept his hand there, a secret anchor to the miserable truth, as he walked up the wooden steps and pushed open the heavy doors. The air inside was thick enough to chew. It was a suffocating mixture of stale cigarette smoke, spilled whiskey, and damp sawdust. The main room was cavernous, lit by dim, flickering neon beer signs and naked bulbs hanging from exposed rafters. 10 or 12 patched members were scattered around, shooting pool, drinking at the plywood bar, arguing over engine parts. "President's back!" someone shouted from the pool table. A chorus of grunts, nods, and raised beer bottles greeted him. It was a show of respect, a ritual. Crow raised a hand in a half-hearted acknowledgement, his eyes scanning the room. He walked straight past the bar, ignoring the bartender sliding a bottle of domestic beer across the sticky wood toward him. He walked toward the back wall. The back wall was painted a dull, peeling black. In the center, illuminated by a single, cheap brass picture light, was the memorial. It was a large piece of polished oak. Mounted on the wood was a pristine, framed photograph of Tommy Spades Kennedy. He looked impossibly young in the picture, his hair slicked back, a cocky, uneven grin plastered across his face. Beneath the photo was a brass plaque, polished to a mirror shine by the prospects. Thomas Spades Kennedy, fallen brother, died defending the patch. 1982 to 2004. Never forgiven, never forgotten. Crow stood in front of the plaque. He stared at Tommy's grinning face. The smell of the damp sawdust in the clubhouse suddenly morphed into the metallic smell of blood on rain-slicked linoleum. He could hear the deafening crack of Cobb's cheap .38 revolver. He could see the way Tommy's legs had given out, dropping him like a marionette with its strings cut. He was coming home. Azrael's broken whisper echoed in Crow's head. Crow felt a sickening wave of nausea roll through his stomach. He swallowed hard, tasting bile. He looked around the room. He looked at the young guys playing pool, laughing, wearing the same death's head patch he wore. They believed the lie. They drew strength from it. They were willing to die for it. They were all standing on a trap door, and Crow was the only one holding the rope. He pulled his hand out of his pocket. The heavy Zippo came with it. He turned it over in his palm, feeling the deep gouges of the botched engraving. DTM. He could throw it away. He could ride out to the desert tonight, dig a hole, and bury the lighter deep in the sand. He could let the myth stand. It was easier. It was safer. But as he looked at the brass plaque, the polished, absolute lie of it, the numbness in his chest finally cracked. It wasn't replaced by sadness. It was replaced by a deep, dark, corrosive anger. Not at Cobb, not at Azrael, but at himself. "You good, Crow?" Crow turned. Brick was standing a few feet away, holding 2 sweating bottles of beer. The big man was frowning, his eyes darting between Crow and the memorial wall. "You've been staring at Spades for 5 minutes," Brick said, his voice dropping slightly, a note of genuine concern bleeding through the gruff exterior. "You thinking about that old man?" Crow looked at Brick. He looked at the devotion etched into the younger man's face. Crow closed his fist around the lighter so tightly his knuckles screamed. He squeezed it until he felt the sharp edges of the steel cutting into his calluses, welcoming the small, sharp pain to drown out the massive, dull ache in his soul. "No," Crow lied again, his voice flat and dead. He took one of the beers from Brick's massive hand. The condensation froze his fingers. "I'm not thinking about him at all." Bass from the clubhouse sound system vibrated up through the soles of Crow's boots, a relentless thudding rhythm that rattled his teeth. The main room had devolved into its usual Friday night chaos. It smelled of spilled tequila, cheap weed, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies pressing together in the poorly ventilated space. Laughter, sharp and cruel, cut through the heavy guitar riffs. A pool cue cracked aggressively against a rack of balls. Crow didn't stay to drink his beer. He handed the sweating bottle back to a confused Brick and shoved his way through the crowd. Men clapped him on the shoulder, their heavy rings catching the dim neon light. Women he barely recognized offered him slack-jawed smiles. He ignored them all, keeping his eyes locked on the narrow, unmarked door at the back of the hall. He pushed through it and slammed it shut, sliding the heavy deadbolt into place. The president's office was nothing more than a glorified storage closet. It lacked windows. The air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of Hoppa's number, 9-gun solvent, and stale cigarette smoke. A battered metal desk dominated the cramped space, cluttered with unpaid utility bills, bail bond receipts, and a half-empty bottle of cheap rye whiskey. A bare mattress lay on the floor in the corner, covered in a gritty sleeping bag. Crow stood in the center of the room. He reached up and unclasped the heavy brass snaps of his leather cut. Usually, taking off the patch was a relief, a shedding of the armor. Tonight, it felt like peeling off a layer of his own skin. He let the heavy leather drop to the concrete floor. It landed with a dull, heavy slap. He didn't pick it up. He just stared at the death's head insignia facing the ceiling, the stitched eye sockets mocking him in the harsh glare of the single overhead bulb. He sank into the squeaking swivel chair behind the desk and dragged a hand down his face. His skin felt greasy, tight over his cheekbones. He reached into his jeans pocket and pulled out the Zippo, dropping it onto the scarred metal desktop. Clack! It sounded louder in the small room than it had in the diner. Crow reached for the bottle of rye. He unscrewed the cap and drank straight from the neck. The liquor burned a fiery trail down his throat, settling like a bed of hot coals in his empty stomach. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes never leaving the lighter. A heavy, rapid knock rattled the locked door. Crow didn't answer. He just poured another mouthful of whiskey down his throat. "Boss?" a voice called out, muffled by the solid wood. "You in there? It's Dutch." Dutch was a prospect, a kid barely out of his teens with knuckles perpetually scabbed from bar fights and eyes wide with the desperate need to belong. He was exactly the kind of kid Crow used to be, exactly the kind of kid Tommy had been. "What is it?" Crow rasped, his voice raw from the road and the rye. "Brick said to tell you the scouts got back from the ridge," Dutch said through the door. "Vipers have a crew moving through Barstow. 3 vans. Looks like they're hauling hardware." Crow closed his eyes. The endless, grinding wheel of retaliation. It never stopped. It just required more fuel, more bodies to throw onto the pyre. "Tell Brick to double the guard at the gate," Crow yelled back. "Nobody rides out alone. Nobody crosses county lines until I say so." "You got it, boss," Dutch answered, his voice tight with adrenaline. There was a pause. Then the kid spoke again, lower this time, almost reverent. "Hey, Crow? Brick told us about that old man trying to extort the club over spades. Want me and the boys to go track him down? We can teach him a lesson about disrespecting a legend. Spades wouldn't have taken that lying down." The rye turned to acid in Crow's gut. The nausea hit him so hard he had to grip the edges of the metal desk to stay upright. The room spun, the smell of gun solvent suddenly suffocating. He looked at the lighter. Death to mechanics. "Leave it, Dutch," Crow said. He had to force the words past the tightness in his throat. "It's handled. Just do your job." "Yeah. Okay. For spades, right?" The kid's boot steps retreated down the short hallway, the heavy bass of the clubhouse swallowing the sound. For spades. Crow picked up the Zippo. His thick thumb traced the jagged, ruined skull. He flicked the lid open. The metallic snick was sharp and clear. He struck the flint wheel. A shower of sparks erupted in the dim light, bright and sudden, but there was no flame. The wick was dry, the fluid long evaporated. He struck it again. Snick, sparks, darkness. He struck it a third time, harder, grinding his thumb against the wheel until the rough metal bit into his skin. Sparks flew, dying before they even hit the desk. He kept doing it, a frantic mechanical motion, filling the small, suffocating room with the sharp smell of burning flint. He didn't know what he was trying to achieve. Maybe he thought if he could just get it to light, he could burn the entire lie down to the ground. But it remained dry, empty, dead. Crow stopped. His thumb was bleeding, a thin smear of red across the rusted wheel. He closed the lid with a snap that echoed like a gunshot. He leaned back in the chair, the squealing springs loud in the sudden silence, and let the darkness of his own choices swallow him whole. Midnight came and went. The party outside began to decay, transitioning from aggressive energy to the slow, sloppy lethargy of heavy intoxication. The music shifted from thrash metal to a low, muddy blues that dragged through the compound like a wounded animal. Crow remained in the chair. He hadn't touched the rye again. He felt incredibly sober. It was a terrible, sharp clarity that offered absolutely no comfort. He picked up his cut from the floor. He didn't put it on. He just held it by the collar, feeling the 50 pounds of stiff leather, chains and patches pulling at his arm. It was his entire life. It was the only thing that gave him power, respect, and identity. Without it, he was just Jackson Miller, an aging mechanic with bad knees and a liver soaking in cheap whiskey. He draped the cut over the back of the swivel chair. Crow unlocked the office door and stepped out into the hallway. He didn't go back into the main room. Instead, he took the back exit, pushing through the heavy fire door into the cool desert night. The air was a shock to his system. It smelled of sage, dry earth, and the faint, lingering odor of the oil drum smoker. The sky was an endless canopy of bruised black velvet, pinpricked with cold, indifferent stars. The noise of the clubhouse was muted here, a dull thumping that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. He walked across the packed dirt, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust. He bypassed the rows of parked motorcycles, their chrome gleaming faintly in the moonlight, and headed toward the back perimeter fence. This was the boneyard, a chaotic, rusting graveyard of salvaged parts, wrecked frames, and rotting tires. Engines sat on cracked wooden pallets, bleeding black oil into the sand. Twisted handlebars reached out from the weeds like skeletal arms. It smelled heavily of oxidized iron, dry rot, and forgotten history. Crow waded into the metal corpses. He moved slowly, deliberately, navigating the sharp edges of ruined fenders and shattered exhaust pipes. He stopped near the back fence, where the shadows were deepest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the Zippo. He didn't come out here to bury it. He wasn't going to dig a hole and hide the truth in the dirt. He had already spent 20 years burying Tommy. He wasn't going to do it again. He stood there in the quiet dark, listening to the wind rattle the chain-link fence. He thought about Azrael Kennedy. The man was probably sitting in a dark motel room right now, the smell of camphor thick in the air, his frail lungs struggling to pull in oxygen. Azrael had given up his ghost. He had unburdened himself and passed the terrible weight to Crow. The old man got to die with the truth. Crow had to live with it. He couldn't tear the club down. He knew that with sickening certainty. He was too cowardly, or perhaps too entrenched. If he told Brick and the prospects the truth, it wouldn't bring Tommy back. It would just destroy the fragile ecosystem that kept these violent, lost men tethered to something resembling a code. The lie was structural now. Pulling it out would collapse the entire building, crushing everyone inside. But he couldn't keep worshiping at the altar of spades either. He couldn't keep selling the myth to kids like Dutch. Crow tightened his grip on the lighter. The sharp edges of the DTM engraving pressed hard into his palm. He would carry it. He would keep the Zippo in his pocket every single day. Every time he felt the heavy steel against his leg, every time he stood in front of that polished brass memorial plaque, he would be reminded of the truth. He would let the guilt fester, a permanent private infection. That was his penance. Not a heroic confession, but a quiet, agonizing endurance. He would be the keeper of the rust beneath their chrome. Crow looked out past the razor wire, staring into the vast, empty expanse of the Mojave Desert. "I'm sorry, kid," Crow whispered. His voice was cracked, barely audible over the wind. It wasn't an apology for the gunshot. It was an apology for stealing the boy's death and turning it into a billboard. "You were right. We should have rode north." He didn't expect an answer. Ghost didn't offer absolution. Crow slipped the heavy steel lighter back into his pocket. It settled against his thigh, a cold, hard lump. He turned his back to the desert and began the long walk back through the graveyard of rusted iron, heading toward the muffled, thumping noise of the only prison he knew how to survive in. Did the raw, unapologetic truth of Crow's choice resonate with you? If you felt the weight of the patch and the heavy burden of a 20-year lie, hit that like button to let me know. Subscribe to the channel for more deeply grounded, gritty storytelling that explores the darkest corners of loyalty, brotherhood, and the ghosts we all carry. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story that refuses to take the easy way out. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Crow's boots? Tell the truth and destroy the club, or carry the lie?